English 3, welcome to our first uh, virtual lesson. I appreciate you all being here. I hope that everyone finds this video and that you're all doing well and that you're safe and being responsible in this unique time. Uh, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us and to engage in the online space as best you can. I definitely understand that these are uncertain times and that this is unique, but I also want to recognize that the best thing we can do right now is to continue on as best we can and to try and keep some sense of normalcy, which is what we're trying to do. So to begin the class, we start with this video, but I also want to just kind of do some housekeeping where I kind of talk about and reiterate some of the things that you read in the email I sent out to you. I do want to also mention that that email, if you didn't get it or if you're not familiar with it or if you want to look at it again, can be found on our topics page right above our new class meeting for today. So our class meeting is class meeting 3. You can find that on our topics page just as you always would. And what you'll see there is on top of our objective and rationale and do now, which you'll be responsible for keeping track of and answering, you'll see a step-by-step of the class activities, what I expect you to do from beginning to end, step by step, and everything that I ask you to do will be additionally tied into the assignments page, and you'll find those assignments there. Uh, just so you know, the way our class is going to work is the first class of the week is going to be me giving you direct instruction in this form. So you'll always find this video of me talking about the text, things to consider, things you want to discuss and consider as we move forward. And that'll lead you into some of the activities we're going to have. And sometimes that'll be prompt writing. Sometimes that will be discussion boards. Sometimes it'll be just taking general notes. So I do hope that you understand that this is going to be what you'll always see to begin a week. And so next week, during our first class meeting of next week, you'll see this as well. So I do want to mention that participation is key, and the way to participate is to make sure that you complete all the tasks, and again, make sure that you understand which tasks will be due by the time our class is up. So if your class begins at 8:30, you have until 10 o'clock to meet those requirements, and if you do, then you have achieved full participation. If we have a discussion board and I ask you to not only contribute to that discussion board, but to respond to someone else's comment, then you have met participation and you've done it in a timely manner. Additionally, what you're going to see is that there's going to be some homework, and that'll be distinctly in the homework section. And so I want you to be aware that the deadline for those assignments is the beginning of the next class meeting. And I'll always indicate that on the assignments page, but I want to make sure that we're clear that there's two different types of assignments, two different deadlines that we're talking about, one for participation in the particular class period and another for homework to be done in preparation for the next class. All right. So with that, I think that's pretty much what I need you to understand, what I want you to pay attention to, and I think we'll be good with this. And like I said, right now at the beginning of this class period till the end of the designated time, I can be reached on email real time, meaning I'll have a quick response to you, and that's how the first class of the week will happen. The second class of the week is actually a little more real-time interactive. So instead of a video by me, we're actually going to have a Google Meet. And I haven't decided yet whether or not we're going to have everyone all at once or if I'm going to break the class in half and I'll do 2 sessions. But those instructions will be coming closer to the second class meeting. And in this case, it will either be Thursday or Friday, depending on your class period. But I want you to be aware of that. I want you to understand that there is going to be some real-time interaction and that I will send out not just how it's going to operate, but what the rules are. Because the only way, if you've ever been in a really crowded Hangout or crowded Google Meet, the more people you have, the harder it is to kind of make things happen. So I'll send out those distinct rules for that. And that's going to be our 2 weeks, and that's how it's going to work out. And I hope everyone manages to navigate that, and I'm here to help, and we'll do this together, and hopefully it'll be a good experience for everyone. So let's move on now, because that's really the extent of what I needed to explain, and now it's time to get into the Baldwin reading. And so I did mention in class last time we met, and I put it on the calendar, although I did put it on just yesterday, Sunday, that I expected you to have finished chapter 2 of Giovanni's Room by our class meeting today. So what I'm going to ask you to do is whenever we have these videos, I'm going to basically talk, and I'd really appreciate if you take the time to take notes. Okay, so if I have a lot of information, I might throw a PowerPoint up there and you can follow along, but I felt like this would be a good opportunity for you, just like in class, to be able to listen, interpret, and capture important moments. And so when I give these lectures or when I talk about these moments in a novel, I want you to write down what the key points are, because later I may ask you to respond and to recall our video here, my lecture notes, if you will. So I want you to be aware of that. I want you to be able to manipulate that and articulate those moments. So right now, I want to give you a moment to take out some notes, whether that's digitally or written. Just have something available so that you can write these key points. So for instance, in today's class, one of the assignments you'll see in our assignments page is that you're actually going to write down, or at least share with me, what you feel the 3 most important parts of this video instruction is. So what were the 3 things that I mentioned about chapter 2 of Giovanni's Room that you felt were the most impactful, that you wrote down in your notes and that you then shared with me? So go ahead and take out that, and I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that. Hopefully we're prepared and we'll get moving. So when we think about chapter 2 of Giovanni's Room, it, again, because Baldwin is dealing with this infinite opportunity of time and space, because we're in David's head as he recalls his childhood, his formative years, his time in Paris, we are taken back to a moment where he meets Giovanni, and we find out that he meets Giovanni through other acquaintances he has. Giovanni turns out obviously to be an Italian man who is working a bartender at this one particular bar. And what I want you to reflect on, and as you think about your reading of the novel, I want you to pay close attention to 2 particular aspects of the novel, which kind of are weaved into Baldwin's narrative of the moment, but I think they reach deeper into what Baldwin is trying to explore with this novel. The first is the interaction between Giovanni and Baldwin when they start flirting with one another. Sorry, excuse me, not Baldwin, but David. The Freudian slip, because we know that David's experience closely relates to Baldwin's experience being from New York, moving to Paris, exploring himself and his sexuality and coming to terms with that. But when we get that banter between David and Giovanni, it actually feels really natural. And Baldwin basically sets the scene in that we kind of lose sight, or at least understand the experience as being universal. So Giovanni and David could be any 2 people, pretty much anywhere in the world. And that's the beauty of Baldwin's writing, is that he humanizes both David and Giovanni. And while we in contemporary times, in contemporary society, understand that there is no differential there, when Baldwin writes this novel and then publishes it and gives it to the masses, this idea of otherness, of that culture, of that uh, you know way of life, of that sexual experience, is foreign. It's completely out of the zeitgeist or out of the common conception within modern, or at least that particular modern society. So Baldwin reflects on that in chapter 1, and he begins to reflect on it in chapter 2 when when David steps into this bar and he sees the different characters and different personas in there. He understands that it is predominantly a hangout for homosexual men, and that there are transgender men and women in there, and he's experiencing all of this. And as he does, David, the character, has this kind of disdain. And I think it's really interesting because we have to reflect on the idea of, where is this disdain coming from? Is it a genuine disdain of the scene that he is in, or is it disdain for himself and what he's feeling? So there's a little bit of conflict there. And so it's something that the reader at that time can expect. Oh, I feel the way David does, or I am alien to this scene in the way that David is. But then it switches. It changes and becomes very cleverly familiar when Giovanni and David have this banter back and forth. And they're just talking about themselves and their experience with the world and their emotions. And we really start to see the humanness of Giovanni and David as two people who are creating a real connection, who potentially are even falling in love. And so the first thing I want us to note is how Baldwin juxtaposes David's initial confusion or disdain with the scene with the very human experience he has and the connection he starts to build with Giovanni. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to talk about is, within that banter, we have this kind of sub discussion of the difference between Paris and New York. And David does this really interesting exploration of how Paris feels old, and it feels like things have happened, where when you're in Paris, you feel like you're looking back into the past. And then he says New York is new, it's shiny, it's potential. So when you're in New York, it's almost as if you feel for the future, you imagine the future. And so Paris and New York become these very distinct polar opposites of one another. They become this dichotomy for David. And I think it's an inverse dichotomy where New York is his past, but it represents the future. Whereas Paris is his present, but it indicates a past that he has come to grow fond of. And I think that interplay of, well, where does David belong? Where does he fit into the world? Where does he feel most at home? And I think that discussion of the comparison between New York and Paris becomes kind of a really internal exploration, a meditation, if you will, that Baldwin is expressing about his own journey, about his own life. And so the mirror that Baldwin is placing up to himself through David becomes extremely personal and extremely real. And so as you're reading it, you should be thinking, as I read David, I can't help but think Baldwin is exploring a stream of consciousness or a way of thinking about his own life and about his own experience. So the autobiographical parallels become extremely evident in this particular part of the novel. And when we wrap up, it really does become this lament, right? Even though it feels real, it feels present. At the end of the chapter, we have David who really laments on the idea that no one will ever be Giovanni, and that Giovanni holds this extremely special place in his heart, even in spite of everything that's happened. And we're still kind of exploring and uncovering the facts of that. So I think what's happening in chapter 2 is that it's continuing with the story that we've heard in chapter 1 about this Giovanni person, about David and his struggle between Hella and Giovanni and those two existences, but it takes us deeper. And within the deeper exploration, we get these subcontexts, these secondary narratives of extreme close relationship and relationship building, and the normalcy of and the universal experience of two people finding each other. So even though it is David and Giovanni at this time in society is taboo, it feels very natural and common. Another sub narrative that's going on here is this struggle that David's going through between his origin and his present. New York, Paris, those two lives and what those mean. Because we constantly get these hints at what David has experienced in his life, particularly back in America. His feelings towards that, they're extremely vivid and visceral, and his fondness for Paris, but at the same time, it still just doesn't feel like home. He a couple of times mentions that Paris is problematic, but overall it feels better than New York. So that's really what I wanted to talk about with chapter 2. And hopefully you understood that we're still new to this, and as we move forward, we have to keep in mind uh, these ideas, and particularly these ideas of struggle with David, right? He's constantly living in the past. He's reflecting on a lot of things as we move to the present, and we have to ask ourselves, where is this all leading us to? Why the deep reflection now? Is it because Giovanni is facing his death? Is it because David has come to some realization? So we're going to continue to explore that, but it's important to know that it's all being influenced by his experience with Giovanni, his move from uh, New York to Paris, and all the experiences that are tied up with that, and even these small experiences of conflict he has between the world he sees and the distance he's putting between that world of men in Paris and their relationships and his own self-recognition, who he is, right? At one point in the chapter, he says he wishes he could have turned away from Giovanni, walked out of that bar, and gone to find a woman, any woman. And it's that struggle between what is socially normal and this affection, this love, this relation that he is beginning to experience. So I really want you to think about that as you reflect on that on the chapter 2 in companionship with chapter 1, because your activities for today are going to ask you to reflect on that, including from this 10-minute, 12-minute instruction, give us the key points. So hopefully you wrap all that up, you engage with this, and if you have questions, we're going to have a discussion board. Feel free to ask those questions on the discussion board. Maybe someone has an insight that will be helpful. Whatever questions are on that discussion board will lead our discussion when we have our Google Meet on the next class. Okay, so hopefully that's a good wrap up, something to think about, a starting point, because that's what these videos are. They're starting points to get you going on what you have to do for the rest of class. So good luck. I'm here if you need anything, and we'll talk next class.